When my mother said it, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't hesitate, and she didn't even look guilty. Her words were calm, clean, and final in the way only someone who believes they have absolute authority can speak. She stood in the doorway of the living room with her arms folded, her face wrapped in the same forced politeness she used whenever she was doing something cruel but wanted to pretend it was reasonable. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 20% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. Now let's get into the details of the story. You need to leave, she said, as if she were simply asking me to move a chair. Your sister is coming with her 2 kids to live with us. She needs the space more than you do. The room went quiet after that, not because anyone was shocked, but because everyone present understood exactly what this meant. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a discussion. It was a removal. My sister, seated comfortably on the couch, didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. She didn't say anything at first, just pressed her lips together in a faint, victorious smile while scrolling on her phone, as if the decision being delivered in front of me had already been agreed upon long ago. Her 2 kids were scattered on the rug with toys, loud and careless, completely unaware that the roof over their heads was being secured by pushing someone else out into uncertainty. I stood across from them all, hands at my sides, feeling that familiar sinking sensation settle deep in my chest, the same one I had felt since childhood whenever my needs conflicted with hers. I wasn't surprised. I was just finally tired of pretending I was. I asked one question, not because I thought it would change anything, but because I wanted to hear the answer spoken out loud. How long do I have? My mother shifted her weight slightly, glancing at my sister before meeting my eyes again. It would be best if you packed today, she said carefully, dressing the demand in courtesy. Your sister and the kids will be fully moved in by tomorrow evening. There it was again, the quiet speed with which my displacement had already been scheduled. My life reduced to a logistical inconvenience. My sister finally looked up from her phone and spoke, her tone light and dismissive. You'll be fine, she said. You're always fine. You'll figure something out. Always fine. That was the family's favorite lie about me. It allowed them to take without guilt. It allowed them to choose her without explanation. It allowed them to treat my endurance as proof that I didn't need protection, fairness, or even consideration. I looked at all of them, my mother standing stiff with self-justified resolve, my sister relaxed in entitlement, the children noisy and oblivious. And I realized something quietly powerful. They genuinely believed I had nowhere to go. That belief was the foundation of their confidence. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't remind them of the years I had paid bills quietly, of the repairs I had funded, of the nights I had stayed when everyone else left. I simply nodded once. Slowly. Deliberately. Then I said the one sentence none of them expected. No problem. My sister frowned for half a second, confused by the absence of resistance. My mother looked relieved, too relieved, as though she had been bracing for a fight and was glad she wouldn't have to justify herself any further. They mistook my calm for weakness. They had no idea it was preparation. I turned and walked toward my room with steady steps, feeling their eyes follow me, trying to read meaning into my silence. Behind me, my sister laughed softly and said something to my mother I didn't catch, probably already planning how she would repaint the walls or reorganize the kitchen. The sound didn't hurt the way it used to. Something inside me had shifted permanently. In my room, I closed the door, leaned against it for just a moment, and let out a long breath. Not of despair. Of clarity. The countdown had finally begun, not to my removal, but to their awakening. I opened my closet and pulled out a suitcase, laying it on the bed with slow precision. I didn't pack in a rush. I packed like someone who already knew where they were going. Document folder first. Laptop second. Phone charger. A few clothes. Nothing sentimental. Nothing heavy. My things had never truly been safe in that house anyway. As I zipped the bag halfway, my phone vibrated in my hand. A notification. Not from my family. From a number saved simply as Attorney Cole. The corner of my mouth lifted just slightly as I read the message. Everything is ready. Let me know when you want to proceed. I didn't reply yet. Timing mattered. Tonight mattered. From the hallway, I could hear my mother on the phone telling a friend how gracefully I had taken the news. My sister's voice floated behind her, already discussing where she wanted the kids' beds placed. They were rearranging my existence in real time, confident that once I crossed the threshold with my suitcase, I would become another vanished inconvenience they would reference only when convenient. They had no idea that by tomorrow, the house they were so comfortably claiming would be the very stage where every quiet favor, every hidden document, every overlooked signature would finally speak. I closed my suitcase and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it for a long moment. For years, I had been invisible by design. Useful. Replaceable. Convenient. Tonight, they believed they were erasing me. In reality, they were only clearing space for the truth to arrive undisturbed. I picked up my phone again and finally typed a response. Tomorrow evening works. While I folded the last of my clothes into the suitcase, the sounds of my sister's laughter drifted down the hallway like background noise to a life that had never truly included me. It was the same laugh she'd had since childhood, light and careless, the kind that always followed her victories and never her consequences. Growing up, everything revolved around her schedules, her emotions, her crises. When she failed a test, the house shut down in sympathy. When I succeeded, the room barely noticed. If her heart broke, the family gathered like a rescue team. If mine did, I was told I was strong enough to handle it alone. That imbalance didn't start today, and it didn't surprise me now. Today was simply the moment where the pattern stopped pretending to be subtle. I remembered being 12 when she flooded the bathroom by leaving the tap on overnight. The damage soaked through the ceiling and ruined part of my room. My bed, my books, my clothes, all ruined in one quiet disaster. My mother hugged her while she cried over her mistake, and my father told me we'd replace my things when we could. Weeks passed. Nothing was replaced. I learned then that my loss would always be secondary to her discomfort, that accountability bent inward where she was concerned and outward where I existed. That lesson sharpened with every year, sculpting me into the quiet problem solver who absorbed what others refused to carry. My sister learned a different lesson. She learned that tears erased responsibility, that charm smoothed consequences, and that expectation belonged to other people. She grew into adulthood with a confidence that had never once been tested by limits. Failed relationships were blamed on bad partners. Financial chaos was dismissed as bad luck. Responsibility was always an abstract concept that lived in other people's lives. When her first child was born, my parents shifted their loyalty even further in her direction, as though grandchildren cemented the hierarchy. I became not only secondary but optional, useful only when labor or sacrifice was required without applause. As I zipped my bag completely closed, I heard my mother's voice rise in the hallway, warm with excitement as she spoke to another relative on the phone. "Yes, she's moved in already," she said proudly, referring to my sister. "The kids are so happy. It feels like a fresh start for the family." I almost smiled at the irony of it. A fresh start built on quiet displacement, dressed up as unity. My existence in that home had always been framed as temporary even when it stretched across years. My sister's arrival, on the other hand, was treated as destiny. What they never questioned was how the bills were paid. How repairs were funded. How the mortgage balances slowly disappeared without ceremony. They assumed stability existed because it always had. They never asked who maintained it. They never asked who had quietly adjusted their life to make that stability possible. I had learned long ago that asking for recognition in my family was treated like greed. So I stopped asking. Instead, I organized. I documented. I protected myself in silence, preparing for a day they never imagined would come. Down the hall, my sister burst into loud laughter, followed by my mother's softer echo. Through the thin walls, I could hear them discussing furniture placements and room colors. They were already planning changes, already overriding the home as if my presence had been a placeholder that expired the moment her need arose. I stood at my window for a long moment watching the sky dim into evening, reflecting on how predictable this all felt. The shock wasn't in being asked to leave. The shock was in how easily they assumed I would vanish without consequence. At dinner, I joined them one last time at the table. My chair felt temporary now, like it belonged to someone already erased from the seating chart. My sister spoke excitedly about schools for her kids, about how much easier life would be now that she wouldn't be doing everything alone. My mother nodded with enthusiastic devotion, already fully engaged in rebuilding her world around my sister's orbit. Not once did anyone ask where I would sleep tomorrow. Not once did they ask if I needed help finding a place. They spoke as though my departure had been handled simply by announcing it. My father, quieter than the rest, watched me from across the table with an expression he had rarely worn in my presence. Uncertainty. Perhaps a trace of awareness was beginning to crack through the comfortable blindness he had lived behind for years. But he said nothing. And in our family, silence always meant consent. After dinner, my sister handed me an old cardboard box with a smirk. "These were in the hall closet," she said casually. "Figured they're yours, so they'll just be in the way now." Inside were old photo frames, books I hadn't opened in years, a few objects I thought had been lost. I thanked her quietly and carried the box back to my room without comment. She believed she was being generous by allowing me to retrieve my leftovers. She had no idea that the real things she was about to lose were already beyond her reach. That night, as the house fell into the loud silence of occupied space and emotional absence, I opened my document folder and reviewed everything one last time. Not because I doubted it, but because certainty is its own armor. Pages of records. Signatures. Financial trails hidden in plain sight. I had learned early that if I ever wanted security in a family that favored someone else, I would have to create it without asking permission. I had done exactly that, step by quiet step. In the living room, my sister was already rearranging decorative pieces, her children running freely through spaces that had once been mine. My mother looked on with proud approval, beaming as if a long-awaited dream were being fulfilled. They believed the house had accepted its new identity. They believed I was already gone. In truth, everything was only just aligning. I lay awake that night listening to the sounds of their comfort, laughter, movement, confidence, and I felt nothing but calm. Not bitterness. Not heartbreak. Calm. Because at last, the imbalance that had shaped my entire life was approaching its correction point. They thought they had pushed me out into nothing. Tomorrow, they would learn how deeply mistaken that belief truly was. By the next afternoon, the house no longer felt like the place I had lived for years. It felt like a stage that had been rapidly redressed for a new lead actor. Boxes lined the hallway, children's shoes were scattered by the door, and unfamiliar bags crowded the living room. My sister moved through it all with effortless authority, issuing instructions to my mother as if the ownership of the space had already transferred to her in spirit. "That couch should turn this way," she said casually, pointing. "The kids need more room to play." My mother nodded obediently, adjusting, accommodating, serving. No one looked at me anymore as I carried my final box down the stairs. To them, I was already a ghost walking through my former life. The first sign of trouble came when my sister decided she wanted to organize the home office. That room had always been a neutral zone, a place everyone avoided because it represented paperwork, responsibility, and things no one wanted to think about. But now she wanted it for one of the kids, a homework corner, she said. I stood in the doorway quietly as she pulled open drawers, scooping files into piles without reading them. Deeds, insurance documents, old loan statements, tax folders, all mixed together in careless hands that had never been trained to respect order. When she held up a folder and squinted at it with curiosity, I saw the first crack of uncertainty flicker across her face. "Why is your name on so many of these?" she asked lightly, half joking. My mother waved it off from behind her. "You know how responsible they are," she said. "Always handling things." My sister shrugged, unconvinced but not yet alarmed. Later that evening, I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low and teasing. "It's weird," she said to whoever was listening. "They acted like they owned the place or something, but Mom says everything's under our parents' name. Still, there are so many financial papers with their signature." She laughed like it was a harmless curiosity. But curiosity has a way of turning into dread when it pulls at the wrong thread. By nightfall, I could feel the house itself shifting. Not emotionally this time, but structurally, as though the walls were preparing for a truth they had sheltered for too long. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Attorney Cole again. A simple message this time: "Tomorrow is confirmed." The move-in had become a spectacle by the third day. Relatives visited. Neighbors waved. The story circulating was that my sister had come home to rebuild her life with her children, and that I had decided to move on. Not a lie exactly, but not a truth either. My sister basked in the attention, playing the role of the struggling mother finally supported by family. My mother followed her like a shadow, doting, defending, excusing. The children ran freely through the halls, and my father retreated deeper into silence, watching everything like a man who sensed a storm but didn't know how to name it. I noticed how often his eyes followed me now, how they lingered with uncertainty rather than authority. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. The disaster finally broke through on the fourth morning, subtle but irreversible. I returned briefly to retrieve the last of my things. As I stepped into the living room, my sister was seated at the table with a stack of papers spread before her like the remains of a dismantled illusion. Her relaxed confidence had vanished. Her posture was stiff, her voice strained as she spoke to my mother. "Mom," she said slowly, "why does this file say the mortgage was paid off under their account?" My mother's face drained of color. My father stood frozen near the doorway. And for the first time since this began, no one looked at me as if I were leaving. They looked at me as if I were returning. The room went unnaturally quiet after my sister's question, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My mother stared at the document in my sister's hands like it had suddenly transformed into something dangerous. My father's mouth parted slightly, then closed again without sound. No one answered her. Not immediately. And in that pause, the carefully constructed illusion they had lived inside began to crumble under its own weight. I stood near the doorway, holding my final small box, watching their faces shift from confusion into something darker, recognition. My sister looked back and forth between them, her confidence draining by degrees as she realized this was not a harmless clerical detail she had stumbled upon. "What does that mean?" she asked again, more sharply this time, her finger tapping the line with my name on it. "Why does it say the payoff came from an account under their name?" My mother opened her mouth, closed it, and then sat down slowly as if the strength had drained from her legs. "It doesn't mean anything," she tried to say, but the words lacked conviction. My father finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Put that down," he said to my sister. "You shouldn't be going through those files." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Why not?" she snapped. "If I'm living here now, I should know what's going on with this house." That single sentence, "if I'm living here now," landed with a quiet finality that made my pulse steady instead of race. The timing was perfect. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a clean blade, precise and unavoidable. Every head turned toward the front door. I set my box down gently against the wall, the faint thud echoing with more authority than any raised voice ever had in that house. My mother swallowed hard. "Who is that?" she asked, though her eyes already betrayed that she sensed the answer. I walked toward the door without rushing, the calm in my body now complete. "That," I said quietly, "would be my attorney." My sister laughed once, sharp and incredulous. "Your what?" she asked. My father's face turned ashen as step by measured step, the realization finally found its way through years of avoidance. When I opened the door, Attorney Cole stood there in a dark suit, immaculate and unhurried, briefcase in one hand, tablet under the other arm. He greeted me with a composed nod that held months of quiet preparation behind it. "We're right on time," he said. I stepped aside and allowed him to enter. The room seemed to shrink immediately under the weight of his presence, not because he was imposing, but because truth has a way of consuming all available space the moment it enters. My sister stood abruptly. "What is this?" she demanded. My mother was trembling now, her hands clasped tightly together as if trying to pray without words. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. Attorney Cole placed his briefcase on the table, opened it with deliberate precision, and glanced around the room as though taking inventory of the emotional debris before him. "I am here regarding property ownership, mortgage settlement records, and legal transfer instruments connected to this residence," he said calmly. "No accusation. Just fact." My sister laughed again, nervously this time. "That's ridiculous," she said. "This is our parents' house." Attorney Cole turned his tablet so the screen faced her. "According to county property records and the finalized mortgage satisfaction documents," he said, "this house has been legally owned by your sibling for the past 2 years. The words landed like an invisible explosion. My sister's laughter cut off mid-breath. My mother gasped audibly. My father staggered back a step, gripping the edge of a chair for support. "That's not possible," my sister whispered. I finally spoke then, my voice steady, barely above conversational tone. "It is not only possible," I said. "It is documented, insured, and irrevocable." The room erupted into noise, overlapping voices, disbelief, denial, and panic bouncing violently off the walls. My mother cried out, my sister shouted accusations, my father tried to speak over both of them. Through it all, Attorney Cole remained unmoved, sliding documents across the table with quiet authority each time they raised a new objection. Deed transfer. Mortgage payoff confirmation. Property tax records. Every paper that had once existed silently in drawers now stood as undeniable witness. "You paid off the house?" my mother choked, her voice cracking. You never told us." I met her eyes evenly. "You never asked," I replied. My sister spun toward my father in fury. "You said everything was in your name," she shouted. He looked at me, pain written openly across his face now. "We assumed," he said quietly. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, only the calm finality of truth reaching people who had chosen comfort over clarity for far too long. "Assumptions are expensive," I said simply. My sister's face flushed red with a mixture of rage and fear. "So what?" she demanded. "You think you can just throw my kids out?" Attorney Cole intervened smoothly, his voice precise. "No one is being thrown out at this moment," he said. "However, legal occupancy will be determined by the property owner." All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of the moment settle fully onto my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility I had prepared for in silence for years. "I told you I'd be gone by tonight," I said quietly. "That part is still true." My mother looked at me in panic. "Then what does this mean?" she asked. I looked at my sister, then at the children who stood watching with wide, confused eyes, entirely innocent of the war being waged in adult silence and adult selfishness. My voice softened slightly. "It means," I said, "that you will not be living here under the fantasy that you displaced me. You'll be here only by permission, not entitlement." My sister collapsed into a chair as if the air had left her lungs. "You planned this," she whispered. I nodded lightly. "I prepared for this," I corrected. My father's voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question carried years of missed conversations inside it. "Because," I said gently, "you never saw me as someone who could do this. And I learned long ago that my strength functioned best when it was underestimated." Attorney Cole began explaining next steps with slow, careful detail. Temporary occupancy agreements. Legal boundaries. A formal review timeline. Everything measured. Everything contained. Every emotional outburst now trapped inside procedural language that stripped it of its power. My sister tried to interrupt several times, but each attempt fell flat beneath the sterile authority of law. My mother wept openly now. My father stood in unnerving stillness. And I stood calm at the center of a storm I had known was coming long before the clouds ever gathered. When the documents had been reviewed, copied, and acknowledged, Attorney Cole closed his briefcase with a decisive click. "Our next meeting will determine duration of occupancy and final residential control," he said. "Until then, all parties are to maintain the property without assumption of ownership." He looked directly at me. "We'll proceed as discussed." I nodded. "Thank you." When he left, the echo of the door closing behind him sounded louder than any argument that had taken place. For several long minutes, no one spoke. Then my sister's voice finally broke the silence, low and trembling. "You were going to let me move in, just to take it back like this?" I looked at her with calm clarity. "No," I answered. "I was going to let you show me who you were when you thought you had already won." The house felt different after the lawyer left, as if the walls themselves had shifted forward to witness what the family could no longer avoid. The tension no longer hovered in implication, it settled openly into the air, thick and unmoving. My mother sat at the dining table with her hands clasped in front of her as though praying without words, her breathing uneven. My father stood near the window, staring outside but seeing nothing. My sister remained rigid in her chair, stunned not only by the truth but by the collapse of the identity she had wrapped herself in for so long, the favored daughter, the inevitable inheritor, the unquestioned center of the family's gravity. The house that had once embraced her without condition now stood in silent neutrality, no longer shaped by entitlement but by law. No one spoke for several minutes. When my mother finally lifted her head, her eyes were red and swimming with regret that had no place left to hide. "All this time," she whispered, "you were carrying this alone." Her voice cracked on the final word. She was not asking a question. She was recognizing a truth she had avoided for years. I nodded slowly, not with accusation, but with confirmation. "Not just this," I said. "Everything." That single word held decades within it, the nights I worked extra shifts without mention, the expenses I absorbed quietly, the sacrifices I had normalized so completely that even I had stopped naming them as such. My father turned then, finally facing me fully. His eyes carried shame, confusion, and something else I had never seen directed at me before, respect weighted down by regret. "We thought you were stable," he said quietly. "We assumed you were okay because you never complained." I met his gaze steadily. "You didn't assume I was okay," I replied. "You relied on it." The distinction landed between us with the weight of undeniable accuracy. For the first time in my life, my silence had not protected anyone else. It had only taught them that I would always absorb what they could not. My sister rose abruptly, her voice shaking with a blend of anger and panic she could no longer disguise. "So what happens now?" she demanded. Do you just take everything and leave us with nothing? The sharpness in her words was familiar, but the fear beneath them was new. I shook my head gently. I'm not taking anything from you, I said. I'm only reclaiming what was never yours to assume. The children watched from the doorway with wide, uncertain eyes, feeling the emotional shift without understanding it. I felt a quiet sorrow for them, innocent witnesses trapped in the consequences of adult certainty and adult selfishness. My mother stood slowly and approached me, her steps hesitant as if unsure she still had the right to cross even that emotional distance. Why didn't you tell us? She asked softly. I did not answer immediately. The question required honesty without cruelty. Because every time I tried before, I said carefully, I was reminded that my needs created inconvenience, while hers created emergencies. She pressed her lips together, the truth too accurate to argue with. My father lowered himself into a chair as if the weight of years had finally reached him all at once. The house no longer felt like a refuge to anyone in that moment. It felt like a courtroom without a judge, where every silence was testimony and every object carried history. My sister's anger slowly collapsed into something closer to desperation. You're really going to make us move, aren't you? She whispered. I held her gaze and answered carefully, that depends on how you choose to live here now. Her eyes narrowed. Under your rules. I nodded. Under respect. The word sounded foreign in the room, as though it had not been spoken there in a very long time. My father's voice broke the fragile quiet. We owe you more than we ever gave you. He did not weep, but his voice wavered under the weight of realization. My mother reached for his hand, both of them now visibly confronting the cost of favoritism they had long disguised as circumstance. My sister looked away, her pride still resisting the dismantling of the identity she had lived inside for so long. I did not need an apology in that moment. Recognition was enough. Awareness was enough. The truth had finally been spoken where denial once lived. That night, I slept peacefully under that roof for the first time in years, not as a dependent, not as a convenience, but as the rightful holder of what my quiet endurance had built. The house no longer pressed down upon me with the weight of erasure. Instead, it stood neutral, open to the future without assumption. The following weeks unfolded with difficult conversations, slow adjustments, and boundaries that had never existed before. My sister and her children remained only temporarily, under agreements that finally stripped entitlement from expectation. My parents moved cautiously now, as if relearning how to see me in full dimensions rather than in utility. Eventually, I left, not in defeat, but in deliberate choice. I purchased my own place, one that held no echoes of imbalance, no inherited distortions of worth. The house remained behind me physically, but its lesson followed me forward. My parents learned to approach me with careful honesty rather than assumption. My sister learned, in quiet and discomfort, that the world did not rearrange itself around her without consequence forever. And I learned something far more important than ownership or vindication. I learned that silence is powerful, but only when it is chosen, not imposed. That strength does not need to announce itself to be real. And that sometimes, the greatest correction is not loud revenge or visible triumph, but the quiet rearrangement of truth that finally places everyone exactly where their actions have been leading all along. They thought they were removing me when they told me to leave. In truth, they were only removing the blindfold from their own eyes. If this story touched you, moved you, or reflected a truth you've lived quietly, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of family, betrayal, resilience, and hidden victories.